Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone, and tonight I'm joined by my good friend, Dee Pierce, the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Dee. How are you tonight?
I'm doing fine, and how you doing, Joe?
I'm doing fine also. Thank you very much. So, let's see. Looks like we have a few people here right at the moment.
Yeah, Steve Wolfbrand just joined.
Hiya, Steve. Great to see you, as usual. So, topics for tonight are China says no. It'll be interesting to see what they say no to. Okay. Also, the Iran talks are still alive. I think barely. I think personally, I think they're on life support, but well, maybe not. Anyway, uh, then there are these delusions the Washington Post is having concerning Russia. So we're going to go over those delusions. And another topic I didn't have a chance to include in the topics, but one that we'll still take up is called Donald Trump's lack of critical thinking skills with respect to Russia. I think that's an interesting topic. And then we're going to do China winning Redux, which will be for the discussion of two articles that we did on Saturday night and that I thought were pretty important pieces. So I guess we're going to start with the usual sharing on Facebook. Uh, so we'll take a little time to do that. Evelina says, "Hi, good one to start with."
Hello, Evelina.
Thanks, Evelina. And it's good to see you, by the way. Okay, I'm going to start then with our first piece, DT and critical thinking. Well, we won't start with that. That's going to be one that we'll take on, down the road. We're going to start with something by Mike Whitney. You see it up there now. It's called "Do You Condemn October 7th?" China says no. Yes, they do say no. And there is, I guess that is Maz Shin Min, a legal advisor to China's foreign ministry. So we'll see how he answers that question, but starting the article. China has never explicitly condemned the attacks of October 7th. What do you know? I guess they've never gone on a program of, Piers Morgan or somebody like that. In China's view, October 7th can't be separated from the more than 7 decades of Israeli brutality, apartheid, and occupation. Naturally, this has drawn harsh criticism from Israel, which expressed its, quote, deep disappointment, unquote, over China's refusal to repudiate Hamas. Even so, China has not caved in to Israeli pressure or
Mhm.
softened um, 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 its rhetoric. Quite the contrary. On February 22nd, 2024, Ma Shin-min, legal advisor to China's foreign ministry and a member of the International Law Commission, summarized Chinese views of Hamas activities during a presentation to the International Court of Justice at The Hague. Here's part of what he said. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict stems from Israel's prolonged occupation of Palestinian territory and Israel's long-standing oppression of the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people fight against Israeli oppression, and their struggle for completing the establishment of an independent state on the occupied territory are essentially just actions for restoring their legitimate rights. The right to self-determination served as the precise legal foundation for this struggle. And this is a quote from MEMRI. The fact that China chose a legal scholar who is a member of the International Law Commission to argue their case underscores the importance China places on the broader legal issue of whether the Hamas attack was justifiable under the rule of international law. Ma concludes that the attack was not only justifiable, but that the militants involved in the attack had an, quote, inalienable right, unquote, where have we heard that term before, to conduct operations that were armed at ending the Israeli occupation. And here's a quote from Ma. Quote, the Palestinian people's use of force to resist foreign oppression and complete the establishment of an independent state is an inalienable right. Struggle waged by peoples for their liberation, right to self-determination, including armed struggle against colonialism, occupation, uh, uh, um, 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 uh, aggression, domination against foreign forces should not be considered terrorism. Ma's statement should not be construed as support for the injuring or killing of innocent civilians. It is, however, a powerful defense of the right of persecuted people to participate in armed struggle against the people who are oppressing them. And this graphic cartoon, okay, of a woman with a dead baby, holding a dead baby, and a bunch of microphones from major networks asking her, but do you condemn Hamas? Most readers don't know that China resisted Israel's occupation and defended international law as it relates to the October 7th attack. They don't know that China took a stand on a matter of principle and never flinched. Of course, most people don't realize that of the 195 countries in the world, only 13 have officially designated Hamas as a, quote, terrorist organization. There are many who believe that the terrorist moniker is applied universally. The rest of humanity sees the world through the same distorted lens as people in America, but they don't. They see Hamas as a national liberation movement that was duly elected to govern Gaza in 2006, following, quote, free and fair elections that were forced on the Palestinians by the Bush administration. Now Hamas is being used as the pretext for the slaughter of women and children on an industrial scale. Excuse me. Most Western leaders have expressed their support for Israel's 18-month bloodbath, while China has only opposed it. It's not only opposed it, but also defended the Palestinians' right to armed struggle. Here's Professor Richard Falk, a leading scholar in international law and former UN Special Rapporteur for Palestine. Quote, the right of resistance was affirmed during the decolonization process in the 1980s and 1990s. This included the right to armed resistance. However, this resistance is subject to compliance with international laws of war. Even the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that, quote, whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, the human rights should be protected by the rule of law, unquote. Israel does not comply with international laws of war. For example, the entire situation in Gaza is one of the most flagrant violations of Israel's complete disregard, not only for the laws of war, but for the entire apparatus of international and humanitarian laws. Palestinians, on the other hand, who are in a permanent state of self-defense, are driven by a different set of values than Israel. One is that they're fully aware of the need to maintain their moral legitimacy in their methods of resistance. Quote again, to the extent that there is real evidence of atrocities accompanying the October 7th attack, those would constitute violations. But the attack itself is something that in context appears entirely justifiable and long overdue, unquote, Falk said. This was published in the Palestine Chronicle. This is why Israel, continuing with the narrative of Mike Whitney, has fabricated so many stories about beheaded babies, mass rape, and the killing of innocent civilians. The intention is to persuade the public that October 7th was not a legitimate expression of political resistance, but a wanton act of terror aimed at ordinary people. Western analysts typically focus on fake atrocities that are used to drown out any reasonable discussion about historic oppression or political realities. Here's Falk again. Quote, one of the tactics used by the West and Israel has been to almost succeed in decontextualizing October 7th so that it appears to have come out of the blue. The UN Secretary General was even defamed as an anti-Semite for merely pointing out the most obvious fact that there had been a long history of abuse of the Palestinian people leading up to it, unquote. He added, referring to Antonio Gutierrez, simply stating that October 7th, quote, did not happen in a vacuum, unquote. That's also from the Palestine Chronicle. And, quote, decontextualizing October 7th, never again is now. There's a picture, okay, of a Jewish boy from Auschwitz in 1945 and a Gazan boy, Gaza, in 2000, okay, in 25. Both looking like they're suffering from starvation. Precisely, the case for genocide is made on the basis that October 7th can be removed from its historical context, quote unquote, and seen as a, quote, standalone, unquote, event that requires a particularly violent response. But October 7th is not a standalone event. This is the unavoidable explosion of collective resistance to decades of ethnic hatred and brutality aimed at a particular people who have been stripped of their civil rights and left to languish in an apartheid state. Here is Ma again. Quote, our state is obliged to promote the realization of the right to self-determination and to refrain from any forceful action which deprives people of that right. In pursuit of their right to self-determination, these people have the right to engage in struggles, seek and receive support on the basis of that right. Quote, numerous UN General Assembly resolutions recognize the legitimacy of struggle by all available means, including armed struggle, by peoples under colonial domination or foreign occupation to realize the right to self-determination. Okay, I'm not going to play the video, but I've already read quite a bit of what it says. Naturally, Ma's speech has largely been blacked out in the Western media, where anything that doesn't drive with the Israeli narrative that October 7th was an act of terrorism winds up, quote, on the cutting room floor, unquote. We're confident that if Ma's powerful moral statement was more widely circulated, Israel's support in the United States would crumble. China offers to rebuild Gaza. China has supported every resolution of the UN aimed at providing humanitarian relief to the people in Gaza. They have been staunch supporters of Palestinian statehood and a two-state solution from the beginning. They have repeatedly called for an end to the fighting and an immediate ceasefire. They have even met with leaders of Hamas and Fatah in April and July 2024 to see if reconciliation between the two groups was possible in order to promote Palestinian unity. Finally, China has repeatedly offered to, quote, rebuild Gaza, unquote, following the end of hostilities, which underscores Beijing's commitment to an independent Palestinian state living side by side with Israel. At every opportunity, China has supported policies aimed at de-escalation, reconciliation, and peace. They have exhibited a type of, quote, moral clarity, unquote, okay, and also moral leadership we would like to see from the United States, but never do. It is China's moral clarity that, quote, guides its decisions, even in complex or ambiguous situations, without being swayed by competing interests, or relativism. It's about aligning actions with a consistent moral framework, often rooted in universal values like honesty, fairness, or compassion, unquote. Israel's savagery in Gaza suggests that the West is in a state of irreversible moral collapse. We should be grateful that China is stepping in to fill the void and lead the world into the next century. On one of the most consequential issues of our time, China has come down on the side of decency and humanity. And there is a picture, a heart-rending picture, to end it off. Dee, any commentary on that?
It was a very effective article.
I thought so too. I thought it was a very moving article.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the Chinese are right on point about it. Let's see what comments we have from our friends. Earl of Laurel says, hi, guys. And hi, Steve. Steve has something for Madeline. Madeline, are you seeing any of those UFOs down in Colombia? Okay, I'm not sure that Madeline is here, is she?
I don't know.
Steve Wolfbrand says, hi, Earl. Okay. So, okay, I think what was so clear about that article was it just so clearly lays out the case, okay, and the line of reasoning, which is, after all, it's an obvious line of reasoning. Okay, it's completely based on, international law and a reading, okay, of international law. And it's not really dependent on whether there were atrocities or not. It's not trying to emphasize the case that many of the atrocities attributed to the Palestinians, are simply Israeli propaganda and the lies. But it focuses on making a clear case that according to international law, the fact of the resistance of October 7th was completely justified and actually was long overdue in coming. The Israelis deserved strong resistance all through the period of the occupation. They got it from time to time, but infrequently, because they were able to repress it. October 7th was something they were not able to repress. I think that Dee has had to leave us for a moment. I expect she will be back, but she was disconnected. Here she is again. Hi.
Hello.
You were disconnected. I don't know why or how.
I didn't either. All of a sudden, I was disappeared out. I had to
I,
bring myself back in.
I am very glad you are back in. Evelyn says she agrees it's long overdue. Okay. So let us move to the second of our pieces. I'm going to close the first piece by Mike Whitney. And the second is by Larry Johnson, the former CIA, the former CIA member, okay, who is now a member of the, okay, of Intelligence Veterans for Sanity, I believe it's called, something like that. I think the organization was founded um, 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 by Ray McGovern and a few others. But Larry Johnson is a very prominent member of it right now. We have three pieces by him tonight, and here's the first one. So please take it away, Dee.
Okay. Iran and U.S. talks still alive. Russia intensifies offensive. Okay, according to Fox, it says tomorrow, U.S.-Iran to resume nuclear talks.
And tomorrow was, well, this is on the 24th of May. So the talks were due to resume on the 25th of May. And I think they did resume on the 25th of May. Please go on.
Okay. Let me just make this a little bit larger. Okay. Iran Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, speaking from Rome, said the recent round of negotiations with the U.S. was one of the most professional and complex so far. He emphasized that while the U.S. now better understands Iran's position, the talks remain too intricate to resolve in just a few rounds. Araghchi confirmed that Oman's foreign minister has presented proposals aimed at removing obstacles which will be viewed in Tehran before any response is given. He reiterated that Iran will not compromise on its red lines and that the next round of negotiations will follow internal consultations on the Omani proposals. Well, he dodged another bullet. As long as the U.S. and Iran are talking, there is hope. The Zionist crowd is still agitating for Israel to commit suicide and attack Iran. The latest example of this is from Mr. Greg Roman, who is currently serving as the executive director of the Middle East Forum, a U.S.-based think tank focused on Middle Eastern affairs. Prior to his role as MEF, Roman served as the director of the Community Relations Council at the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh. His career also includes positions within the Israeli government, where he worked as a political advisor to the deputy foreign minister and held a role in the Ministry of Defense. He writes, Israel will strike Iran's nuclear facilities within days.
Wow.
This, this sobering conclusion emerges from the convergence of alarming intelligence assessments, failed diplomatic efforts, and lessons from this week's Middle East Forum, War Game Simulation. The Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency now warns that Tehran can produce sufficient weapons-grade uranium for a nuclear device in, quote, probably less than 1 week. From Jerusalem's perspective, this shrinking timeline leaves virtually no margin for error. The fifth round of U.S.-Iran nuclear talks in Rome has crystallized the impossibility of a negotiated solution. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff's departure mid-meeting on Friday, officially due to his, quote, flight schedule, while technical teams remained, signals more than schedule conflicts. The core dispute remains irreconcilable. Iran insists on its, quote, right to enrich uranium domestically, while Washington demands zero enrichment capability. Roman clearly did not pay attention to Foreign Minister Araghchi's commentary on the meeting. We will see if Roman qualifies as the new Jewish prophet. As a note in a recent post regarding these negotiations, any Israeli strike on Iran can only be done with U.S. assistance. If that happens, and I pray to God it does not, Iran will survive the attack and will retaliate with devastating consequences for Israel, the U.S., and the Gulf Arabs.
Okay, so here I'd like to comment and say that, okay, I agree with what Larry has to say here, except that it assumes that Israel is going um, um, to attack Iran uh, first, and that Iran will refrain from attacking Israel, but will wait for Israel's attack, okay, and then is going to retaliate. But I wouldn't exclude the possibility that Iran, getting all kinds of intelligence about the efforts of Israel to attack, I would not assume uh, uh, that Iran uh, is not going to beat them to the punch. Uh, I think they certainly have the capability to do that. And if they do that, they would probably save themselves quite a lot of difficulty, because they certainly have the capability to hit all of the air bases inside of Israel and to destroy them all,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore to prevent uh, most of a serious attack by the Israelis upon them. Uh, anyway, I just wanted to introduce that possibility to the discussion. Please go on, Dee.
Meanwhile, NATO's proxy war with Russia continues to go badly for the Ukrainians and NATO. Berzelman's latest update spells bad news for a French cargo ship trying to deliver weapons to Ukraine in Odessa. The Russian Ministry of Defense confirmed a precision strike using an Iskander missile against a cargo vessel transporting 100 containers of military equipment to the port of Odessa. The vessel was reportedly carrying Western supplied arms. The strike triggered a secondary detonatation and a large fire at the port. Joe?
Sorry, I got a little too enthusiastic about looking at that explosion. So, wow, they hit a French ship.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the strike triggered a secondary detonatation and a large fire at the port, further damaging Ukraine's NATO-backed logistics infrastructure.
So that's a video of Odessa on fire,
Mm.
and says Russia sank a French vessel with the help of the LAT. I don't know what LAT is. And the headline: Russia attacked French forces. In Odessa. What were French forces doing, in Odessa?
I was thinking the same.
Yes.
It says here, I also suggest you take a look at Andrei Martyanov's latest update, which provides a good summary of Russia's push to create buffer zones in Ukraine.
And there is another video on the buffer issue there,
Mm-hmm.
and another little story from Larry.
Here is a good news story of a heroic Russian army nurse. Russian President Vladimir Putin awarded the Hero of Russia Star to a nurse of a motorized rifle unit, Corporal Lyudmila Bolya. Nurse Bolya was at the command post during a missile and artillery strike. Seeing that her comrades were wounded, she, despite the threat to her life, ran out to save the soldiers. Lyudmila managed to pull several soldiers out from under the fire when a new strike began. The nurse covered the seriously wounded man with her body, taking all the shrapnel on herself, after which she was taken to the hospital. In the following video, Putin asked jokingly how such a tiny woman could
I'm sorry. How a tiny woman could cover.
cover a larger man.
Sorry about that.
Finally, here's a video of my conversation on Friday with Dayashman, an Indian doctoral student. He's a sharp kid. He discussed Trump's encounter with South Africa's Ramaphosa.
Yeah. So there are a number of videos that were attached to this blog
Mm-hmm.
by Larry. They're all worth seeing, but of course we don't have time to go through them here. So that's the first post from Larry Johnson. We're going to go through, see if we have any comments on it here. Eveliness is curious that if the attack on the French vessel and troops wasn't talked about in European news. I don't think it was talked about in American news either. I didn't see it anywhere. It was a pretty big attack. Yeah, I didn't see anything either. It was a pretty big attack. And the fact that it's not being covered here is dangerous because obviously what Russia is starting to do and has stated its intention to do, but what it is starting to do is to attack European allies who go to Ukraine to assist the Ukrainians in the war. And Russia is basically taking the position that if you're assisting the Ukrainians in the war, uh, uh, then you are participating, in the war against the Russian people, uh, and that Russia is going to hold you accountable by attacking your people and your vessels, and by destroying whatever you're bringing to Ukraine to help the people there. So Russia is beginning to treat people helping Ukraine as basically co-belligerents, okay, in this war. And that's very dangerous, of course, because it means the possibility of escalation is right here now. So, Evelina asks whether the UK is next. I think it depends on what the UK does. It could be Germany is next, because it also depends on what they do. But next, I'm going to share the screen with another one of Larry's pieces. This one about Russian delusion, coming from the Washington Post. This was by Larry on May 25th. And there is a burning tank, probably after it was hit by a drone. It lies about Russia's status in the war, and its lies about Russia's status in the war in Ukraine were valued at $1 million for each lie. This article from Washington Post reporters would reduce the U.S. multi-trillion-dollar debt by at least 10%. Let's call this article Chicks on Parade. It was written by Karen DeYoung, Catherine Belton, okay, and Mary Ilyushina. Not a military analyst in the group, and based on their reporting, all are devoid of any ability to do critical thinking. Here's their opening tirade. Quote, Russia's battlefield strength in Ukraine has started to wane, and it could run into serious shortages of manpower and weaponry by next year, even as President Donald Trump retreats from pressure on Moscow to end the war, according to senior U.S. and European officials, okay, and military experts. Absent the negotiated settlement or, quote, robust, unquote, Western assistance, the war, quote, probably will continue to slowly trend in Russia's favor through 2025, unquote, according to a U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency assessment presented to Congress 10 days ago by the agency's director, Lieutenant General Jeffrey A. Cruz. But Russian gains, quote, are slowing and continue to come at the expense of high personnel and equipment losses, unquote. Slowing, says Larry. These three WAPO ladies were spoon-fed Ukrainian propaganda dressed up as impeccable intelligence from Western sources, gobbled it down like ravenous vultures. Note, on the very day this article appeared, Russia launched a massive missile and drone strike all across the breadth of Ukraine, slowing. Multiple independent sources report that Russia is attacking and advancing all along the 1,200-mile line of contact. This article is not an honest assessment of the war. It is a political hit piece designed to pressure Donald Trump into pumping more weapons, more money and weapons into Ukraine. Over the past year, Russia has taken only a 0.6% of additional Ukrainian territory. I'm reading now another quote from the article. At the cost of 1,500 killed or wounded per day, current and former Western officials said. Quote, Russia is very gradually taking bits of territory still, but at an unsustainably high cost, unquote, said Richard Barons, the former head of Britain's Joint Forces Command. Some officials have estimated Russia's total casualties at more than 1 million. This passage is disingenuous at best. Russia is not trying to conquer all of Ukrainian territory. As of April 2025, Russia controls approximately 65 to 70% of Ukrainian territory east of the Dnieper River, reflecting incremental but strategically significant gains over the past year. Territorial control east of the Dnieper. Baseline pre-2022, pre-invasion, Russia occupied approximately 7% of this area. Crimea plus parts of Donbass. Post-2022 offensive by early 2024, Russia held 55 to 60% of the East Bank after capturing the Luhansk Oblast, Sevierodonetsk, Lysychansk, and parts of Donetsk. 3 in the 2024-2025 advances. The Avdiivka salient, Russia expanded control westward by 15 to 20 kilometers, adding approximately 300 square kilometers. Chasiv Yar, early 2025, fell after months of fighting, opened a path toward Kostiantynivka. Kupiansk, Lyman axis, Russian gains added 100 square miles in northern Donbass. Southern Donetsk advances around Vuhledar, and Novomikhailivka secured another 200 kilometers square. Total new gains, 2024 to April 2025, approximately 600 to 800 square kilometers, 3 to 5% of Ukraine's total land area. What these three ladies and their Western sources still fail to comprehend is that Russia is executing a war of attrition, not a war of territorial conquest. Their goal, which is succeeding, is to bleed Ukraine and NATO dry. The ladies continue. Russia has pummeled Kyiv and other regions, launching 250 attack drones and 14 ballistic missiles overnight Friday, according to a statement by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Russian officials claim more than 700 Ukrainian drones were intercepted over Russian territory within the past 72 hours, nearly 100 of them near Moscow. But drones and long-range strikes do not conquer territory and will not win the war for either side, officials and experts said, unquote. Really? Subsequent to this article being submitted to the WAPO editors, Russia followed up on Saturday and Sunday with a bigger encore. On the night of May 24th to 25th, Russia launched a massive aerial assault, deploying aerial assault on Ukraine, deploying a total of 367 drones and missiles. This included 298 drones, primarily Iranian-designed Shahed models, and 69 missiles, comprising 9 Iskander ballistic missiles, 56 cruise missiles, and 4 guided air missiles. If you're bad at math, let me help you. Between Friday night and Sunday morning, Russia launched 548 drones and 83 ballistic missiles. Despite Ukrainian claims that they shot most down, the Russian weapons reached and destroyed their intended targets with minimal civilian casualties. In their closing paragraphs, these three ladies put in an enormous order for barbecued crow. Quote, the Kremlin has drawn a record number of recruits this year, although many have been enticed with cash payouts and the expectation the war will soon end. But the rate of Russia's advance on the ground has been slowed to a near standstill, in part because of Ukraine's fortification of a 10-mile defensive zone littered with mines and trenches, and the use of short-range drones to attack any Russian approach to the front lines, according to Jack Watling, the senior research fellow for land warfare at the Royal United Services Institute in London. Quote again, Russia is actually culminating in its ability to conduct an offensive, unquote. Barron said, quote, it is very unlikely now that the Russian military have the equipment, the people, and the training and logistics to mount an offensive that would break the Ukrainian line, and even if they did, to exploit it, to immediately exploit it, unquote. Even if Russia succeeded in gaining more Ukrainian territory, the Kremlin is unlikely to achieve its stated goal of seizing full control of the 4 regions it illegally annexed in the fall of 2022, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, according to Dara Mesikat, senior research fellow at the Carnegie Russian Eurasia Center. Spoiler alert, Russia is signing up 50,000 recruits per month and are well on their way to seizing complete control of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. I ain't holding my breath for a mea culpa from these 3 intrepid stenographers. I would have added that they are well-paid stenographers. I'm not aware of very much in payments to Larry, but I am sure people who work for the think tanks these people work for are well paid. And of course, the people who work for the Washington Post are quite well paid as well. What is missing? Oh, nothing more than an assessment of Ukraine's staggering losses in manpower and equipment, especially since January 2025. Even if we accept as true the false Western claim that Russia suffered more than 1 million killed and wounded since February 2022, well, why accept that false Western claim, Larry? Ukraine has lost an estimated 1.2 million killed in action. Given the disparity in size between Russia and Ukraine, Russia is at least 5 times the manpower reserves as Ukraine. Well, I don't know if I'd say 5 times the manpower reserves. It might be more than that. There is no way that Ukraine can continue to sustain these kinds of losses. Moreover, Secretary of State Rubio admitted during his testimony for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last week that the United States has no more Patriot batteries to send to Ukraine. Ditto for artillery shells. In summary, this latest piece from the bowels of the Washington Post had one purpose: to try to guilt Donald Trump into supplying more aid and increasing sanctions on Russia. Good luck with that, says Larry. I would not wish them luck with that, but of course it doesn't matter if we do or we don't. It will be determined by the mercurial President Trump himself. Okay, I think Larry should probably have talked about the relative likelihood that the Ukrainian army will not make it through this summer. There's so much evidence recently of collapse. Okay, I really don't think that the war is going to go beyond 3 more months. Not from all the various pieces of news, okay, that I've read. And that's especially true because when you start talking about Russian fatalities, all the estimates I've seen from alternative sources are that those range from 100 to 130,000. And that the estimates of Ukrainian fatalities are up to 1.3 million to 1.5 million. Some people definitely favor the higher of those two figures. And I think they have very plausible reasons for thinking that. Joe Logan says, hello, people. There is no money to be made from peace, so this sort of stuff is going to keep on happening. Evelina says the three graces are a disgrace. Can't say a part of me isn't irked by the use of women to play stupid. Thank you, Evelina. Yes, they're well compensated, but still, well, the fact that they're well compensated simply means that those who are well compensated are not necessarily more knowledgeable than those who are ill compensated, such as Larry Johnson. I don't think Larry makes much for his blogs, but I'd rather read him any time than those people from the WAPO. Joe Logan says women can generally manipulate men playing dumb. Oh, God. John B. says if Germany sends long-range Taurus missiles to Ukraine, the Russians may well hit the Taurus missile production facility at the source. I think Meretz isn't conscious of such risk. He is setting up the U.S. for World War III. I don't know whether he's conscious or not, but I don't think he'd like to see an Oreshnik hitting the middle of the Taurus missile production facility in Germany. I really don't think he would like that very much, and I don't think he's capable of retaliating. So much the worse for him. I really don't understand Mertz at all. I know he's worked for, BlackRock, and that may explain a lot of his behavior so far. But he just seems to be tempting fate. Evelina says, can't say I have much consideration for them, but they do reflect on women as a whole. I don't know why they reflect on women as a whole. I mean, I don't understand. To me, they're just some people who are hired by WAPO and who got into the middle of those social circles and who were influenced. That's a particular bubble in which people mainly talk to themselves. They get socialized into certain attitudes, and these women have gotten socialized into those attitudes. So I think that's what's going on here. So D, I now have a good one for you that I'm going to share the screen on. It's also about Larry. I thought that was a particularly good one.
Yes.
Okay, take it away.
Okay, Donald J. Trump's lack of critical thinking skills with respect to Russia and Ukraine. It was written the 26th of May, 2025.
Sorry. Oh, God.
I know, it's too much.
Yeah, we could have done without that.
Exactly. Donald Trump grabbed headlines on Monday with the Sunday outburst, directed primarily at Russia's Vladimir Putin.
Oh yeah,
Here's his rant. Ugh. I've
yeah.
always had a very good relationship with Vladimir Putin of Russia, but something has happened to him. He has gotten absolutely crazy. He is needlessly killing a lot of people, and not just talking about soldiers. Missiles and drones are being shot into cities in Ukraine for no reason whatsoever. I've always said that he wants all of Ukraine, not just a piece of it, and maybe that's proving to be right. But if he does, it will lead to the downfall of Russia. Likewise, President Zelensky is doing his country no favors by talking the way he does. Everything out of his mouth causes problems. I don't like it, and it better stop. This is a war that would never have started if I were president. This is Zelensky's, Putin's, and Biden's war, not Trump's. I'm only helping to put out the big and ugly fires that have been started through gross incompetence and hatred.
I don't think he's helping with anything.
I don't think so either. I mean, you could have changed things around here, but just take out the words Ukraine and Russia, and you could have said Gaza and Palestine. I mean,
Yeah,
Gaza, Palestine, and Israel.
yes, he could have, and he still would have been doing nothing to help.
Right. He says nothing about all the civilians in Gaza. You have in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. There's nothing about them being killed.
Right, but also with respect to Ukraine itself,
Mhm,
he could end that war in a very short time simply by ending the shipments coming from the United States
mhm.
and by ending the intelligence help that we're continuously giving them. Those drone attacks over the weekend, and particularly the one that was aimed at taking out the helicopter of Vladimir Putin as he went to Kursk, that could have triggered the Third World War if they had been successful. And they couldn't have carried out that drone attack without getting intelligence help from the Allies. We can't be sure that the intelligence coming from the Americans, involved uh, the drone attack on the helicopter of Putin. But it's very possible that it was American intelligence. Uh, anyway, very dangerous, to direct an attack on the president, of Russia,
Oh, definitely.
not just because uh, his death would, make things worse, simply because he's the head of Russia. But the evidence is that he is the most moderate of the leaders of Russia. Uh, so, if he is killed, the attacks on Ukraine would become more comprehensive, more forceful, and more vicious, and much more likely to escalate to attacks on the Allies. It is Putin who has been constraining this war to Ukraine itself. Very, very dangerous. Please go on.
Gee, why would Putin order massive strikes on Ukraine on May 24th and 25th? Quote, no reason whatsoever? It appears that no one briefed Trump on what Ukraine did starting May 19th. Between May 19th and May 25th, 2025, Ukraine conducted a significant escalation in its drone campaign against Russia, launching over 700 drones across various regions. May 19th to the 22nd, Russia reported intercepting at least 485 Ukrainian drones across 13 oblasts, including 63 targeting the Moscow region. May 23rd to the 25th, over a 3-day period, Ukraine launched extensive drone attacks deep into Russian territory, disrupting civilian life and restraining Russia's air defense system. Russian authorities reported intercepting over 700 drones, including nearly 100 near Moscow, leading to closures of major airports and jamming of mobile internet across several regions, the Washington Post. Just imagine how Donald Trump would react if Mexico or if Mexican drug cartels launched 700 attack drones into the United States. We all know the answer. The U.S. would be bombing Mexico as we speak. Trump's failure to acknowledge the precipitating actions of Ukraine is a reminder that this man is driven by emotion, not thought or reason. Trump's outburst, in my opinion, is a disgrace. Russia's reaction to Trump's statement highlights the difference in the quality of leadership in Russia with the juvenile clown show in Washington, D.C. Rather than attack Trump, the Russians played it cool. Putin spokesman Dmitry Peskov made the following diplomatic comment. Of course, the beginning of the negotiation process, for which the American side has made great efforts, is a very important achievement. We are truly grateful to the Americans and personally to President Trump for their assistance in ongoing and launching this negotiation process. Of course, this is a very important moment, which is connected with the emotional overload of absolutely everyone. At the same time, Putin makes those decisions that are necessary to ensure the security of our country. I don't know if Putin and Trump will have another conversation in the near future, but if it does happen, I expect that President Putin will remind Trump that he was responding to the massive Ukrainian drone attack. Unlike the Ukrainians who targeted civilians, the Russians hit military targets. The evidence for this is clear. Although Russia launched 548 drones and 83 ballistic missiles over the weekend, only 30 civilians died. If Russia was just using reckless violence without regard for what it was hitting, then the civilian casualties should have been in the thousands. If
Yeah,
this conv- yeah,
I'm sure Russia hit only military targets.
yes.
That's the only way that only 30 civilians could have died.
hmm If this conversation happens, I expect that Donald Trump will tell Putin, quote, Vladimir, I see your point. Unfortunately, that will be said in private. What Donald Trump has accomplished with this juvenile outburst is to inflame U.S. public opinion against Russia in general and Putin in particular, painting Putin as an insane leader who uses violence for no good reason, is simply feeding the neocon narrative and is likely to generate more pressure for Trump to endorse imposing more sanctions on Russia and its trading partners. I discussed this at length with Nima.
And the video, okay, is posted there on his site. Okay, and you can access the full discussion. Okay, so let's see whether we have any comments on that. Okay, I guess I'll add. Uh, I think that's the real story of what happened. And I completely agree with Larry that uh, the response of the Russians to the silly statements by Trump pointed out the differences in quality between the Russian leadership and the White House, okay, right now. Trump went off half-cocked. He does a lot of things half-cocked. He's terrible when it comes to details. He didn't look for a reason why Russia might have attacked. He was honest enough, when questioned by a reporter who told him about the drone strikes of Ukraine, to say, well, he hadn't really heard of that, and perhaps that was a reason, okay, for the attack. Okay. But the big question is, when he was informed of the drone attacks by the Russians, why didn't he immediately search for a reason? Why didn't he get his people on the carpet and force them to give him the background of whether there were any possible reasons for the Russian drone attacks? He certainly would have gotten some statements out of them. And if it turned out that they persisted in misleading him, then he would have been in a very strong position to fire them all. But instead, he went off, obviously half-cocked,
Mm-hmm.
and did not know any of the background. There are many reasons why it's right to say that he is not fit, okay, to be president. And I say this with the full background of all the streams where I discussed the unfitness for the presidency of Joe Biden,
Mm-hmm.
successor. So I'm not coming at this because I was a fan of the Biden administration or the Obama administration or any recent administration. But I'm saying that this instance of Trump's going off half-cocked is a prime example of why he is not fit to sit in the presidential seat. He should have kept his mouth shut until he understood more of the situation. But he never keeps his mouth shut. He
And
always
what he,
half-cocked.
hmm and part of the article, when it stated that he was trying to rally up his base.
Yeah, he's always concerned to do that. But that's no way to get successful international relations accomplished.
No, it's not.
No way at all. You don't play politics when you're on the verge of nuclear war. You don't worry about inflaming your base. What you're worried about is not causing an international incident which will escalate into a nuclear war. Trump continues to act like a frustrated 6-year-old. I'll stop sharing that and look to see if we have any comments. Mr. Wonderful has joined and has a series of comments. Joe Logan has his statements. Evelina says, Dr. Joe, thanks for the reflection, but it's not naive to think women like these in leadership positions will reflect on women as a whole for many in our soul. I take your point, Evelina. I take your point. Okay, I was replying from a purely personal point of view that I do not generalize, about all women simply because the Washington Post has some idiots working for it. I've been watching the idiocy of women from the Washington Post now for a very, very long time, for years and years and years and years. And I
Mhm.
certainly don't think the women they hire are a reflection on all women. No way. Joe Logan said all politicians are corrupt. They work mainly for corporations, especially the banking corporations. Yes. Mr. Wonderful says, hello, everyone. Says, I will explain Russia's SMO very simply. Russia's SMO equals R2P. R2P stands for right to protect. This is in accordance with the UN Charter and this international law. Yes, I understand. And the Russians were very careful in setting up the SMO as well. And there's no doubt in my mind that given the sequence of events, that their intervention in Ukraine was entirely legal under international law, at least as well justified as our intervention in Yugoslavia during the 1990s. In fact, I think the justification for their intervention in Ukraine was actually very similar to the justification for our intervention. But we hypocritically always ignored that kind of thing. We being the United States, I mean. According to the UN Charter, the criteria necessary next to R2P are seriousness of harm, purpose, and military force as a last resort. Yes, yes, yes. R2P is guided by strict criteria of seriousness of the harm done to the population, the just cause for intervention, intervention by military as a last resort to coerce peace. Seriousness of harm led to the Azov terrorism, the just cause to intervene, prevent genocide of ethnic Russians, intervention by the military as a last resort, Russia's entering SMO peace after peace negotiations ignored, equals R2P. Yes, Mr. Wonderful. I completely agree with that wonderful little diagrammatic setup you did there. Joe Logan says Russia has been fighting Ukraine, so don't the Ukraine people have a right to defend themselves? Uh, Joe, okay, it's really the other way around. The aggressor here was the Ukraine government. Okay, had also the Nazi influence in that government, and the repressions of the ethnic Russians inside of Ukraine following the coup of 2014. Okay, and the change of the regime in 2014. Almost immediately, there were attempts to repress the, the Russian minority living in the eastern part of Ukraine right after the government was shifted in 2014. There was a war that occurred between the Ukrainian government
Mhm.
and the people of the eastern part of Ukraine between 2014 and the beginning of 2022. And it's well known that some 14,000 people died, as a result of the actions of the Ukrainian government between 2014 and 2022. And it was only when the Ukrainians refused to negotiate that the SMO was started by the Russians, nor was the military attack by the Russians in any sense an overwhelming attack. It involved only 90,000 troops, and it was undertaken in order to give the Iranians, basically a slap upside the head, so they would pay attention. And there were negotiations in March and April of 2022 to end the war at that time. And a treaty actually was negotiated to end the war. It wouldn't have involved any transfer of territory from Ukraine to Russia at that time, but there would have been a recognition of Crimea, as Russian. But outside of that, the whole of Ukraine would have remained entirely intact. The eastern part would have had a degree of autonomy, and the oppression of the Russian minority would have stopped. The negotiated agreement at that time was torpedoed by the intervention of Boris Johnson, delivering messages of support, from the United Kingdom and from the United States if Zelensky failed to finalize that agreement. They basically ordered him not to sign, the agreement, said they would support him completely and that he could continue fighting with Russia. So he decided to refrain from signing the agreement and continue the war. His continuation of the war is on him and is on the West. After that happened, then the Russians got serious about the war, and they started the military buildup and the war of attrition, the results of which we see now. But all of these results, including the 1.5 million fatalities which the military of Ukraine has now sustained, could have been avoided if the government of Ukraine had signed the negotiated agreement of the early part of 2022. All the destruction that's come about since that time is on the head of the collective West and the Ukrainian government. Mr. Wonderful says, I will source statistics that validate this. Mr. Wonderful, people who have been watching this program know the story. We've gone through it many, many times with statistics. Still, we welcome any more you may have. Joe Logan says the MSM never reports the real truth, nor major news networks of the world are now owned by 6 corporations. Mr. Wonderful says since 2/17/22, in the DPR alone, within 914 days when Russia came to aid Donbass, Ukraine targeted, murdered 5,043 civilians, 149 children, injuring 97 civilians, and 452 children. Thank you for that statistic. The source, official data of the DPR, representative office in the JCCC. What's the JCCC, by the way? Biden has dementia and shouldn't have still been in office. Trump is a mental case himself. Mr. Wonderful says, I may be the only commenter, Joseph. I scrolled up. I stand corrected. Thank you, Mr. Wonderful. Okay. So let us move away from the current situation and focus attention again, on the issue of why China is beating the hell out of the United States. I mean, I know there's no war between the United States and China right now. I'm not talking about they're beating the hell out of the United States in war. I'm talking about uh, if you look at the two nations and their developmental patterns, okay, the Chinese are flying and we are stagnating. Our developmental path is wholly inferior to China's. They are in the process of uh, catching up to us and passing us, almost as if we are standing still when it comes to modernization, and to development. There are reasons for this, and they are outlined in the two articles we went over last time, which we are bound now to go over again because they are so good at pointing out the reasons why China is beating the hell out of us. So I'm going to share the screen for the first of these articles again, which is entitled The Secret Sauce of Chinese Industrial Success. Smart state planning plus ferocious market competition. Wabin is the author of this piece, which we got from Leon's review. It's a pretty short piece, but it really outlines the reasons very well for what has been happening. Once again, in standard Western economic textbooks, state planning and market competition are mutually exclusive. Thatcher and Reagan brought Western capitalism into the neoliberal phase by claiming, quote, government is not the answer, government is the problem, unquote, putting market fundamentalism on the altar. On the other side, Soviet central planning proved rigid and wasteful, leading to the eventual collapse of the USSR. Observing and learning from others' development path, China went through three different economic models in the past 70 plus years. 1949 to 1978, nearly a 30-year period. Emulation of the Soviet central planning phase, which provided the country a heavy industrial foundation, but failed to deliver an adequate standard of living. 1978 to 2012, freewheeling, laissez-faire, full-on capitalist phase. Just to call it that, I think, is a surprise to people who only think of China as communist China. Communist China had a freewheeling, laissez-faire, full-on capitalist phase, which saw a rapid economic growth, rising standard of living, but also wealth disparity, environmental degradation, and low value-added industrialization. And the third phase, 2012 to now, one of mixed state planning and market competition phase, which is featured by state-led industrial upgrade programs, intense market-based competition, rapid improvement in industrial sophistication, and hopefully rise above the middle income trap to become the leading industrial powerhouse. Wabin goes on, the current model is antithetical to Western mainstream economic theories, but has led to success stories like the Made in China 2025 program. And then the references to wabinoliver.substack.com, revisiting Made in China 2025, MIC 25. That is a brilliant article full of facts by Wabin. We treat it here time early at an earlier time, and I recommend it now for you to get into real detail, impressive detail. Bob says, I thought it would be interesting to discuss the features of this unique China model and the implications. Two parts of this model, state planning and market competition, form an integrated approach to national economic development. State planning incorporates these elements, identify key industries to focus upon, set concrete and tangible targets, e.g. the 200 plus goals, I think they were 225, set in MIC 2025. And the third bullet point here is aligning policy support. Then he goes into a little more detail, important detail. The planning function is carried out by the China State Planning and Development Commission, which assembles the best minds in the government, academia, think tanks, and industries, and goes through multi-year research, studies, and survey to understand and predict key technological trends and future market demand. Then they iterate and socialize the plans until there is a broad buy-in. Once top-line state planning priorities are set, central government empowers local governments to implement the policies. At the implementation level, fierce market competition becomes the norm. In other words, the key advantage of capitalist economies is brought to bear at the implementation level. Local governments compete with each other. In other words, even local governments get involved here, not just local businesses. Each local government is powerfully incentivized to create local tech and industrial champions as career advancements are typically tied in with the achievements of national priorities. Local governments will unleash suites of policy support measures to attract and help businesses succeed, including preferential tax, land use priority, preferential bank loans, even venture capital financing from government agencies, e.g. Shanghai and Shenzhen, each has multi-million-dollar semiconductor funds. Other policy support even extends to establish educational programs at universities to train and develop scientific and technical talents, specifically for identified industries and technologies. Examples are AI, robotics, hypersonics, mining of rare earths, and refining, rail, shipbuilding, etc. Roll out talent acquisition programs to provide housing, allowances, and compensation equalization schemes to attract talents to move to their cities. Some governments even provide WeWork type of office facilities to startups for free. Invest in infrastructure upgrades, including 5G coverage, EV charging stations, high-speed rail, ports, bridges, etc., to enable smooth operation of large industrial enterprises. Invest in local parts and component supply chains that can be plugged into specific manufacturing sectors. Promote successful technical leaders and executives in critical industries into senior government positions, e.g. the head of AVIC, the leading aeronautic business in China, was promoted to become a provincial governor. The central government went so far as to crack down on monopolistic consumer tech companies such as Alibaba and Tencent in 2019, as these companies were consuming too much financial and talent resources and were preventing startups from emerging. Imagine that happened in this country. I mean, what would have happened to Microsoft, for example? Or what would have happened to Facebook? Uh, I mean, things would have been entirely different here. Going on, the main goal of the crackdown is to redirect resources funding talent to more productive directions such as AI and hard tech. As a result, in the key technological and industrial hubs across China, from Shanghai, Shenzhen, Wuhan, Chengdu to Hefei and Changsha, you will find hundreds of EV companies, solar energy companies, AI and robotics startups, shipbuilders, and drone companies that are developing innovative technologies, building production capacity, and engage in intense competition for consumers. So, consumer is king there, not here. In the competition, there are private businesses, state owned enterprises, and foreign companies as well. All have to compete for customers on price and quality and operate with razor thin margin. Innovation and cost efficiency are prized in a never ending loop of hyper competition. The Chinese industrial and technological ecosystem is often described by insiders as, quote, uh, um, 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 as, quote, arena for gladiators, unquote. In a survival of the fittest environment, the winners of such competitions emerge as world-class champions. The same model is replicated in industry after industry, from EV, smartphones, solar energy, robotics, shipbuilding, AI, large language models, drones, chip making, and biopharmaceuticals. Many people mistakenly assume the Chinese state planning model means the government picks the winners and losers. That cannot be further from the truth. State planners pick the priority industries, define the swim lanes, provide policy incentives, and then market takes over to decide the winner. In contrast, the U.S. industrial policy is more guilty of government picking winners. Just witness how both Biden and Trump surround themselves with senior executives of incumbent tech giants when they announce policies such as the CHIPS Act, Inflation Reduction Act, or the Stargate program. Almost by definition, the main beneficiaries of these industrial policies will be the companies in the room. Market competition doesn't seem to play the same decisive role as in China. As China accelerates the third mixed economy phase of its industrial development, we can expect to see more Chinese companies that will innovate faster, scale in the largest single market in the world, and become world-class competitors in their industries. Profit margins will be kept low as competition will never rest. However, more consumer surplus will accrue to customers, leading to improvement of living standards for all. So all I have to say about this is, okay, is this communism? To me, this is not communism. It has nothing to do, with Marxism, Leninism. It might be characterized as a state form, okay, of capitalism. In form, it looks quite similar uh, to Hamiltonian policies here in the United States, which we abandoned a long time ago, but which were very responsible for the rapid development of the United States in the 19th century. Uh, okay, but of course, it's more precise than the Hamiltonian policies were. What's very interesting here is how they socialize policies, okay, and decisions by basically taking them down to the local level and gaining the participation of local communities, providing incentives for local communities to implement the ideas that are generated at the national level. Uh, the reliance on intense forms of market competition to choose the winners, okay, and losers. That's certainly consistent with capitalist forms of ideology that we have here. I find that really extremely interesting. And I also find that it suggests that we in the United States could practice this kind of governance ourselves, and it would be very much more consistent with our ideas about the importance, okay, of markets, the importance of entrepreneurship, the importance, okay, of innovation, that the Chinese form of governance would be much more similar to the ideology that we supposedly believe in than the form of government we have now, which seems to be evolving towards a form of quasi feudalism. It's no wonder so many of us are falling behind. Now, we know that the Chinese government has been successful in lifting almost 1 million people out, okay, of poverty. This is happening at the same time that our government seems to be condemning more and more people to poverty, while fewer and fewer people monopolize the wealth and the capital resources of our society. This is not capitalism. This is a form of feudalism that we see developing here. We don't see that, okay, in China. We see markets in a critical position at the lower levels, okay, of the uh, 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 economy. We see the government setting broad guidelines for development based on the conception of public purpose that the Chinese leaders have. And evidently, their views of public purpose very much put promoting the prosperity of the people at the center of their thinking. Of course, this is a very short article, but when you get into details like the great progress the universities are making in China, the scope and vigor of the educational programs, the efforts to recruit talent from all segments of their society, the massive and imaginative infrastructure upgrades and projects. It's interesting, we earlier pointed out that China has offered to help with the rebuilding of Gaza. Many people have said that it will take a decade to, rebuild Gaza, maybe decades plural to rebuild Gaza. I think not so if the Chinese get their hands on it. I think they could rebuild Gaza in 3 years. And you see from this short outline here how they would do the rebuilding of Gaza, how they would manage it, how they would handle it. And you also see how the United States would be able once again to develop very, very rapidly. This article doesn't even take into account the important strength which the United States has as a monetary sovereign. We don't have to worry about deficit spending here because we don't have to issue debt in order to finance that kind of deficit spending. We could just use the power of the government, to issue money in order to deficit spend. We don't have to increase the national debt. Of course, however much we want to increase the national debt doesn't matter from the standpoint of our ability to pay it off, because we create the currency here, and we can create as much currency as we need to pay off the national debt. But insofar as the national debt is a political issue, we could lay it to rest if we want to, by paying it off as it falls due. And we could spend as much as we need to spend in order to redevelop our society and bring everyone in it into a prosperous and a productive state. We could do that with MMT perspectives as the financial engine, and with the kinds of processes they are using in China to harness the full strength of market competition, guided by a comprehensive conception of the public purpose. We would be able to develop a green and sustainable and a prosperous United States. Once again, I don't even look at this in terms of competition with China. I don't think competition with China is in the end very important for us. I mean, competition to what end? I think the accomplishments of China are great and will be greater, and we should wish them luck and tend to our knitting here. We should not hesitate to take those methods of theirs that work, as outlined in this article. We should take them over here and combine them with American ideas that have proven successful in other societies, like the ideas that have been very successful in Japan to produce quality products. Those ideas were originally developed here in the United States. The quality movement started during World War II here in the United States, when certain key American thinkers who arose out of the pragmatist movement here in the United States. When I say the pragmatist movement, I mean philosophical pragmatism. And they brought the first applications of quality models to American industry in the Second World War. But after the Second World War, we forgot about that. We turned over the economy again to the large corporations, to do what they will. And they proceeded to develop along the lines of feudalism again. And they forgot about all about the quality movement. And some of the leading quality thinkers moved to Japan and developed the quality movement over there, which led for a while to the domination of the auto industry by the Japanese automakers. Now we see that the same quality constructs being widely applied in China. And they have there an auto industry which is on pace to eclipse the rest of the world when it comes to innovation. I think the Japanese will still be able to compete, but it's important, to remember that all of them are competing with quality ideas which originated here in the United States in the 1930s and 1940s, and which has come back now around to certain companies here in the United States, but is not generally applied here still. But in our past, Hamiltonian ideas, of development, ideas from the quality movement, combined with ideas from the way China is proceeding to develop, can help us to produce a wonderful society here. And key ideas from MMT, in particular, the ideas about how government financing proceeds, and the ideas advocating for a federal job guarantee. Those would be very key ideas in redeveloping the United States and making it a center, of innovation, not, of course, the sole center, of innovation, but helping us to turn inward towards the development of our own country and building prosperity, for, our own people. While this is going on, we have to recognize that we have a nation of 340 million people. The Chinese have a nation of 1.4 billion people. The Indians, a nation of 1.5 billion people now. That these nations with larger populations, than our own, will follow their own path to prosperity, and to development. And they are bound to surpass the United States as centers of manufacture, just by way of the fact that they have more human resources to draw upon. We should not be thinking of dominating these other nations. We should be thinking about being the best that we can be for our people and fulfilling the public purpose, okay, of this country. But we should look on what is going on in China as providing us with very important ideas of how to proceed. And those ideas are summarized in this great article, by WAPO about the secret sauce of Chinese industrial success. That can as well, when coupled with ideas from MMT and the quality movement, these can also be the secret sauce of American industrial success as we rebuild our society and move into a much more prosperous sort, a future. So, have you any comments on this, Dee?
Very, very well written article. Yeah, it was a very good article, actually. And, we should be paying attention to China, in a positive way. And it always gets me how they're using our historical financial system.
Yes,
Yeah,
it gets me too. They have so much in common with that, and they're using it to their advantage. And we have forgotten what we learned, so long ago. We have forgotten it and replaced it with the false ideas, okay, of neoliberalism and the ideas of the importance of financializing, the economy for individual profit, uh, rather than continuing to emphasize our own productivity and the
hmm
dynamism of our own uh, um, 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 economy. Please go on. I'm sorry that I interrupted.
No, that's fine. It's just, it's infuriating because things could be so much better here. If we got away from this greed or if we never got involved with it.
Yes, I think that is very, very true. Evelina says Ukrainians are fighting Zelensky recruiters, putting up quite a fight these days. They've had enough. I've seen videos. Yes, I think they are fighting the recruiters. I think the people have had enough and they want out of the war. I think the Ukrainian state is going to collapse in very short order now. Joe Logan says there's no money to be made from peace, so things like what's happening are going to keep happening. I think China is just
Mhm.
bettering itself. Yes, they are, and I'd like to see us here in America do exactly that. Evelyn says, but isn't it true deficit will continue to be a political issue as long as it serves the political class? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Uh, People lose confidence in their society when there are obvious political and economic failures that take place, and failures in military affairs as well. These failures are accumulating for the United States, and they are destroying, the legitimacy of the neoliberal model. That's one of the reasons why Trump got elected, because he was not running as a neoliberal. he sounded like he was different. Now, of course, he obviously falls back into neoliberalism quite easily, but that doesn't change the fact that people have lost faith in it. They've lost faith in financialization. They've lost faith in a society that no longer has the manufacturing capability it once had. So, I think what continues to make the deficit a political issue is that in order to supposedly finance our deficit, I say supposedly because it doesn't finance the deficit, but we think it does. What we think finances the deficit is selling debt instruments. I think the deficit will continue to be a political issue as long as we sell the debt instruments. From the standpoint of MMT, that doesn't change the underlying financial facts because the debt is no problem. But as long as the people who want to do austerity can terrorize the population with the size of the debt, then the deficit will continue to be a political issue. But if we can get a Congress in there that will work with the president to stop issuing debt and simply finance the deficit by fiat of the government, that will remove the debt issue from consideration. If we minted a $100 trillion platinum coin, that would allow us to pay down the national debt by 50% in less than 3 years, in less than one presidential term. That would be the end of the terrorism practiced on us by those who talk about the growing national debt. Everybody would be able to see that the government was easily able to pay off the debt whenever it wanted to pay off the debt. Meanwhile, private business interests would be clamoring for the government to issue more debt so they would have a safe place to put their cash. We could handle that by having the Federal Reserve pay interest on deposits without the government having to issue any debt instruments. That would take care of any clamoring for the issuance of, government debt. In other words, just keep your assets at the Federal Reserve and get interest paid on it by the Federal Reserve. That doesn't count as debt in our system. So that and the paying down of the debt instruments would remove the deficit as a political issue. We could get people to focus on the deficit as the creation of private sector net financial assets, which is what it really is. To be more precise, non-government net financial assets. That's what the deficit actually does. We'd finally be able to teach that to people without the distraction of their worrying about the debt. Evelina says, of course, as you've reiterated all along, we require a different political class. We need to dump the corruption by voting them out of office. Yes, Evelina. Of course, we're not going to get anywhere if we don't change the political class. Hopefully, people will begin to see this. And when I talk about what's necessary to do to dump the corruption, people will begin to listen and they will vote that way in 2026. Eveliness is eventually a coalition party will form that will seduce more Americans. I hope so.
Mm-hmm.
John B. says China came down very hard on corruption. Till the U.S. does the same, there will be no change. I agree. That's why I feel so strongly about dump the corruption.
Mm-hmm.
Can't stand between organized criminals and their billion-dollar profits. The people come last in the United States. The only way to make the people come first is a strong dump the corruption campaign that gets rid of anybody in Congress who is taking big money. We've got to neuter the influence of their money. That will end the corruption in the legislature. That will end the corruption in the presidency. That will lead to the expansion of the Supreme Court to add new justices who are not themselves corrupt. Evelina says, a solid third party. Yes. And John B. says, U.S. governance is now an arm of corporate power. John B. says, we haven't forgotten, Joe. The elites have discovered great wealth can be sourced by tapping into government finances and lawmaking. Right? War and weapons manufacture are for corporate profit. Effectiveness is via propaganda production. Works so long as the enemy is not at a peer level. Russia and China have revealed the ineffectiveness of U.S. weapons. Yes. Especially the Russians have revealed so far the ineffectiveness of U.S. weapons. I think China has begun to reveal the ineffectiveness of Western weapons. For example, in the recent small war of Pakistan and China, the Indians went into that war with an air force that was supposed to be more advanced than the Pakistani Air Force, which relied on Chinese J-10 planes. But it turned out the Chinese Air Force was actually more effective because even though its individual planes were inferior, it worked with communications technology that integrated the J-10 planes with one another and allowed them to coordinate to attack the technically superior planes which the Indians had. So a number of the French Rafale jets, which are supposedly as the advanced as the F-35s, were shot down by Chinese J-10s, which are 2 generations ago, but which operated with an integrated form, of air offense. So that was, an interesting result. Anyway, I think it's time to move on from the secret sauce of Chinese industrial success to Mike Whitney's article. Once again, let me share that.
Okay.
And that's yours, D, at this point.
Okay.
get the title up for you.
Okay, Mike Whitney, and this is May 22nd, 2025. Here's why China is beating the pants off the USA. Our single biggest priority is to improve the lives of ordinary people. Xi Jinping, President of China. Polling data clearly shows that Americans prefer capitalism over socialism. In fact, it's not even close. A 2021 Gallup survey found that 60% of Americans view capitalism positively, while only 38% felt the same about socialism. A 2025 Rasmussen Heartland poll reported that an even bigger disparity, with an impressive 71% saying they prefer free market economics over socialism, which garnered a meager 12% support. The clear implication of these surveys is that Americans overwhelmingly support capitalism over a system of government in which the state exerts greater control over key industries and the distribution of wealth. There is, however, reason to believe that these surveys do not provide an accurate picture of the way people actually feel. If, for example, we check the results of other surveys, we find that attitudes towards the two systems are more ambivalent than we might think. What pollsters in America have found is that, regardless of what party is in power, the vast majority of the people don't feel represented and don't think the issues that they care about are addressed. In 2025, for example, a majority of Americans believe the country is headed in the wrong direction. A Reuters Ipsos survey, April 25th, 2025, found that fewer than 1 in 3 Americans believe the country is headed in the right direction, with a majority expressing concern about the economy, tariffs, and political extremism. Morning Consult's Daily Track, May 12, 2025, reported 56% of the U.S. adults saying the country is on the wrong track. A December 2025 Ipsos poll showed 69% of independents, 59% of Republicans, and 78% of Democrats believed the country was on the wrong track.
I think the significance of that poll is, first of all, that 59% of the Republicans think that the country is on the wrong track. That is very significant. But that 69% of the independents think so. That is also very, very significant. Between 69% of the independents and 59% of the Republicans, I mean, that's 69% of 40% of the country and 59% of roughly 30% of the country. Okay, that means that the heavy majority of 70% of the country thinks that we are on the wrong track, okay, and needs change.
Mhm.
That is only reinforced by the 78% of Democrats who believe the country is on the wrong track. In fact, I'm surprised that the only 70%, 78% of Democrats believe the country is on the wrong track. I would have expected that result to be at 95% of Democrats believing the country was on the wrong track. Of course, that was taken in December 2024.
Right. After an election, which, knowing Trump was coming into power.
Knowing Trump is coming into power, but now having seen what Trump has done since he's come into power, it's much more likely now that you would get 90 or 95% of Democrats believing the country was on the wrong track.
Hmm.
Anyway, I'd like to see what such a poll would show now.
Yeah. The results were equally dismal under President Joe Biden, as one might expect. What this suggests is that one's own philosophical bias, whether you like capitalism or socialism, over socialism, matters less than one's perception of whether the government is effectively implementing the policies that serve the interests of the people or not. When it
Right.
comes, yeah,
And okay, there I would emphasize, I would put it in a little different way, one's perception of whether the government is effectively implementing the policies that serve the public purpose of the United States or not. Anyway, please go on.
okay, when it comes to government, people tend to be more pragmatic than ideological. In short, uh, what is that? Efficacy trumps dogma.
Yes. Okay, the word
Uh,
okay is efficacy.
yeah, efficacy, yes. By this standard, the quote, communist government in China is among the most popular in the world.
Okay, communist there is in quotes,
Yes.
and it should be in quotes.
Right, because it's not what people think.
It's not what people think, and it's not what communism is supposed to be.
Exactly.
Something different.
Public opinion polls consistently show extraordinarily high levels of support for the central government. This may come as a surprise to many Americans who think they live in, quote, the freest country on earth. But it is true all the same. The Chinese people overwhelmingly support their government, do not regard it as authoritarian, and think it is doing an excellent job of increasing prosperity and raising standards of living. Harvard Ash sent a study from 2003 to 2016. This long-term survey, one of the most comprehensive by a Western institution, found that in 2016, 95.5% of Chinese respondents were either, quote, relatively satisfied or highly satisfied with the central government in Beijing. Factors included economic progress, nationalist sentiment, and positive state media coverage. General trends 2020 to 2025, studies like those from the China Data Lab 2023 and China Leadership Monitor confirms high regime support, high regime support, often above 80 to 90% based on questions about trust in the CPC, pride in the political system, and satisfaction with economic performance. Support is tied to economic growth, e.g., poverty alleviation of 800 million since 1978 and stability.
Right. And also, we should note here CPC is the Communist Party of China.
Yes.
Okay, please go on.
Posts on X cite Harvard and other Western surveys claiming less than 90% of Chinese support the CPC. Reviewing it, its system as democratic and effective. These align with academic findings but reflect pro-government narratives. These numbers are literally off the chart. They show that people in China overwhelmingly, quote, support and trust their government and think it is doing an excellent job of reducing poverty, lifting standards of living, and steering the country towards a peaceful and prosperous future. Well, because China is doing those things,
It is
and
doing those things.
the people are seeing it. They're witnessing it.
Right, and you wonder what such a survey would show for the United States.
Look,
It would not show anywhere that level of support for the people who have been running our country.
mm,
Okay, there's this graphic. It's the global manufacturing output comparison chart. Okay, would you like to go through it?
you can go. You can go through it.
Okay. So We have some numbers here comparing the manufacturing output of various countries. The numbers are in trillions of dollars, so it means everything was converted to dollars, and everybody is compared, okay, in terms of uh, the value of their manufacturing output, okay, in U.S. dollars. Uh, the overwhelming leader in this comparison is China. Their manufacturing output at the time this measurement was taken, and I'm not sure the year, was $5 trillion. By far, that's the largest of the balls shown here. The number two country is the United States, and the manufacturing output, the value of the manufacturing output of the United States at the time of this measurement was $2.5 trillion, dollars, half the output of China. Now, some people would be very discouraged by that. I am not so discouraged. The reason why I'm not discouraged is because China has 1.4 billion people, and we have 340 billion people. So, if we normalize these measures simply by dividing them by population, so we looked at manufacturing output per capita, we would find that the United States still has a substantial lead over China. I do not say this to encourage us to stand still. That is, not my point at all. I think we have to work very hard to improve our manufacturing capacity and our accomplishments in that area. And China provides a good model to follow. But I make that point in order to show that the United States is still a very important country when it comes to manufacturing output. While I recognize that China is moving up on us very rapidly, they have not surpassed us when it comes to manufacturing output per capita. So, okay, other nations, the third nation has $1.2 trillion. That is Japan. We should point out that the population of Japan right now is something like 120 million people. So it's roughly 1/3 the size of the United States. So if you looked at manufacturing capacity per capita, or I should say manufacturing output per capita, if you divide it by population, probably the number one country here in terms of manufacturing output would be Japan, okay, not the United States. Okay, the United States would be in second place. I haven't actually done the division, so I don't know where China would be, but it would still be very, very important as a manufacturing power and would probably come in up third. Anyway, other important nations, Germany at 0.9 trillion. Also, Russia is at 0.36 trillion. And Russia still has a long way to go when it comes to manufacturing capacity per capita. Of course, Russia is very, very successful in terms of its military manufacturing capacity at this point, because it appears to be able to outproduce the whole of the collective West, including the United States and Europe, when it comes to the area of of military manufacturing capacity. Okay, other important countries: South Korea, $500 billion. The figure for Russia is $360 billion. The figure for Mexico is $330 billion, and for India, $600 billion. So this is a measure of how, even though India is growing very fast and is important as a manufacturing power, and will one day undoubtedly be vying for first or second in the world. Okay, right now, its manufacturing output per capita uh, is really well below, a lot of the other nations, because it has 1.5 billion people in it. Anyway, some other important nations: Italy, 350 billion. Uh, I think I've mentioned all the important ones. Okay, at this,
Mhm.
and I introduced the idea that even more revealing would be a comparison chart of manufacturing output per capita. Continuing with the article, go ahead, D.
Okay. Given the disparity between the survey results in the US and China, we wonder if Americans' preference for capitalism over socialism reflects a clear understanding of how each system actually works, or if their opinions have been largely shaped by propaganda. Bottom line, people care less about ideology than they do about jobs, health care, stable prices, good education, and some reasonable government accommodations to take care of people who are too old or sick or mentally impaired to provide for themselves. They want a government that will create an environment where they can make a decent living and raise their children in safety. These are not extravagant demands. Even so, they do not appear to be a priority among Washington's political class.
That's why that political class has to go.
Mhm. There are many reasons why China is doing better in this regard than the United States: special interests, corruption, etc. But certainly incentives play a significant role. In the US, millionaires can become billionaires overnight without contributing anything of value to society. It's just a matter of how adept they are at trading paper assets on Wall Street. In America, the market system is so degraded that companies are allowed to buy back hundreds of billions of dollars of their own stock in order to push share prices higher, allowing them to skim hefty profits off the shuffling of paper. These stock buyback transactions are entirely legal, even though the capital is deployed in a way that fails to boost productivity, R&D, worker training, innovation, or anything else. It is simply a way to fiddle the system in order to enrich professional speculators. In the US, wealth is generated through financial engineering, not through productivity, efficiency, or innovation. As we said earlier, the incentives are all wrong.
So here I have to introduce the comment that uh, the legalization of companies buying back their own stock is fairly recent. It dates from something like, I forget the date. I think it's 1980 or 1985. Okay, it's a fairly recent date. It corresponds to the victory of neoliberalism as an ideology for the United States. So during the heyday of the United States, 1950, 1960, um, um, even 1970. Uh, the kinds of games that are now played on Wall Street involving buying back your own stock. Uh, I mean, that was not something legal. It was not a thing. Only in recent years, has it become a thing. If we recapture the political system, one way to improve the orientation to productivity as opposed to financialization is to stop the buybacks of stock. Simple thing. We could outlaw it. Once again, it hasn't worked. Its results have been terrible. And it's something concrete we could do to change the system. Okay, please go on.
Okay. Made in China, sold on Amazon. Share of items sold on Amazon by country of origin. China 71%, US 30%, India 14%, Germany 6%, Mexico 5%, Japan 5%, and Vietnam 5%.
Okay, I think so. One way to look at this chart is to say, well, China is really dominant in terms of selling things, on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
71% as opposed to the 30% of the United States and the 14% of India and so on. Okay, but another way to look at this is uh, even when China's become so important, uh, we still have products that are quality enough and that are cheap enough to account for 30% of the
Excuse
sale,
me.
on Amazon. So China is not so dominant that it completely dominates uh, sales, okay, on Amazon. We still have companies that produce here that can do very well on Amazon. So I'll put a positive twist on that, a positive spin on that particular one. Okay, please go on.
If the Western-style system actually deployed capital to productive outlets of investment, then one would not expect the country with the largest and most liquid markets in the world to also have rising poverty, a shrinked middle class, surging homelessness, falling standards of living, and some of the most dilapidated, out-of-date infrastructure in the developed world. But in the US, capital is not deployed to productive outlets of investment. It is recycled into financial systems that function as a wealth generation mechanism for voracious billionaires who use their money to buy yachts, luxury mansions, and glitzy baubles at Tiffany's. Take a look. Total stock buyback in 2024. According to S&P Dow Jones Index, S&P 500 companies spent a record of $942.5 billion on stock buybacks in 2024. This figure represents an 18.5% increase from the $795.2 billion spent in 2023. In the last decade, 2015 to 2024, that sum soared to $7.33 trillion. $7.33 trillion.
Yeah.
Whoa. Even worse, a sizable portion of the money devoted to stock buybacks is coming from, quote, massively underfunded public pension funds that retired workers depend on for their survival. According to Brian Reynolds, chief market strategist At New Albion Partners, quote, pension funds have to make 7.5%, so they are putting their money in those levered credit funds that mimic long-term capital management in the 1990s. Those funds, in turn, quote, buy enormous amounts of corporate bonds from companies which put cash onto company balance sheets, and they use it to jack their stock prices up, either through buybacks or mergers and acquisitions. It's just a daisy chain of financial engineers, and it's probably going to intensify in coming years. How a public pension crisis is driving an epic credit boom. Financial Sense. Here's more. Stock buybacks. S&P 500 companies spent a record $942.5 billion on buybacks in 2024, roughly $1 trillion in 1 year. Dividends. S&P 500 dividends reached $629.6 billion in 2024, up 7% from 2023. Total shareholder returns, combined buybacks and dividends, totaled $1.572 trillion in 2024. For context, a 2019 to 2022 study of 280 large U.S. corporations reported $4.4 trillion in profits, with $4.4 trillion spent on buybacks and dividends, suggesting a near 100% payout ratio for some firms. Think about that for a minute. So, between the year of 2019 to 2022, every dime of profit was diverted to personal enrichment. Explain to me how this embraces the capitalist ideal of deploying resources to productive activity. Is it any wonder why China has left the US in the dust?
Okay, so compare this to the Wabin article, where the companies compete with one another in intense market competition, which minimizes the profits of the companies in the first place because they have to compete so vigorously with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So, what profits they make, they also have to devote to improving the investment base of their company. This has to cover their technology advancement and anything else to make their company more competitive over time. Okay, let me make a sort of general point about this. In the ideal model of capitalism, which still comes out of The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's book, written in 1776. The ideal model was a model of relatively small companies, all competing very vigorously with each other for the money of the consumers. In other words, that was the model. Uh, it was a model of intense competition, low margins for the firms that could not compete would go out of business continuously. It was a survival of the fittest kind of model. And that was considered the ideal because in the ideal capitalist model, the consumer was left as king. The consumer was was benefiting from the intense competition. Well, the way the Chinese have set up their capitalist model, their market competition uh, 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 occurs at the local level and involves new small startup companies coming to the fore and competing with each other very, very vigorously. So the Chinese have set things up to more closely appropriate the to more closely approximate the type of capitalist model that was envisioned by Adam Smith at the beginning of capitalism. It's ironic that the Chinese communists have created a model of economics that more closely approximates the Smithian ideal of capitalism than what we have in the United States today. That is an irony, of history. But the point is, the ideal capitalist model, which was supposed to maximize productivity, is a model that the Chinese more closely approximate than what we're doing here in the United States today with the financialization of capitalism and the development of corporate models that more closely resemble the ideals of feudalism than capitalism. Okay, please go on.
This, this explains why business investment, capex, is at a record lows. It's because the bulk of earnings is being recycled into buybacks, which in turn is being used to further inflate the Wall Street asset bubble.
Of course, they can't do this in China, right? It's no part of the Chinese system.
Nope.
It's just here.
It's a big circle, and it can all be traced back to cheap money, artificially low rates, easily available credit, and financial engineering. Corporations no longer look for ways to grow their businesses, expand operations, hire more employees, improve productivity, or innovate. Instead, they look for ways to load up on debt, goose their stock price, and walk away with a bundle.
I don't know what that's a picture of, but I certainly would like to know. Okay, I would wager it's some Chinese city, but I don't know. It looks so futuristic.
hmm
Okay, please keep going.
It's all about incentives, and the Fed has created incentives that encourage debt leveraging, stock manipulation, and fraud, whereas other governments incentivize growth and productivity. The quote profit motive is supposed to be the energy that fuels the capitalist system and leads to innovation, efficiency, and productivity. But as you can see, stock buybacks undermine those outcomes by diverting money into personal enrichment and elite indulgences, which begs the question of whether the current system is really capitalist at all. We should also note that in 2024, it estimated 235 billion, 25% of the 942 billion total of S&P 500 stock buybacks were purchased with credit, which points to a gigantic asset bubble that will cause severe damage to the broader economy where markets fall sharply. In contrast to the US model, the Chinese government prioritizes productivity and growth over financial engineering, asset stripping, or profiteering. They see the financial system as a means to an end, and that end is the creation of a prosperous and harmonious society in which all boats rise. Along with its 4-decade-long industrialization policy that has transformed China into the world's biggest manufacturing superpower, China launched another massive project in 2013 called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the largest and most ambitious in history based on its scale, scope, and global impact. From 2013 to 2024, China has invested over a trillion in BRI projects, with 121.7 billion allocated in 2024 alone. The BRI spans more than 150 countries across Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America, covering 60 to 75% of the world's population and over 30% of global GDP. It includes roads, railways, ports, pipelines, and digital infrastructure. Over 3,000 projects have been completed or are underway, including the 68 billion China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, the 13.6 billion Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway, and numerous African rail and port developments. No infrastructure project in history comes close to the BRI's 1 trillion investment or 150 country scope. It's frequently compared to a 21st century Marshall Plan, but with broader geopolitical impact. RE not only links remote locations to market around the world, it also increases the speed at which products and merchandise can be delivered to wholesale and retail buyers. The visionary project anticipates a world in which economies are more deeply integrated, spreading prosperity to places across the planet. The World Bank estimates the initiative will lift global GDP significantly while reducing poverty in areas that are affected by improved infrastructure and increased trade. No other project rivals its scale or vision. The difference between America's hyper financialized model of capitalism and China's state-led model could not be starker. Keep in mind the Belt and Road Initiative invested a meager 12.7 billion in projects in over 150 countries in 2024, while US corporations dumped nearly 1 trillion into stock buybacks that added nothing to overall productivity. Even with the paltry commitment of resources, China is credited with building the most transformative infrastructure project in history. And here's One Belt, One Road.
Yep. Here's the scope of that wonderful and revolutionary project. This doesn't include, though, projects which have been started and which somehow will integrate with the One Belt and One Road in South America. In particular, one outstanding project is the Chinese have built a port in Peru that was built in such a way as to make it ideal to connect across the Pacific to Shanghai. Okay, now Brazil, okay, is building a railroad to cut through the jungle and cut through the mountains and connect up to that particular Peruvian port. And so it will feed the goods that are produced in Brazil, into Shanghai, through the Peruvian port. It's a massive project that's going on right now, and the Chinese are supporting that, okay, as well. Okay, please go on.
China does not reinvest all the profits from its state-owned enterprise into production. In sectors like, quote, energy, telecom, and infrastructure, for example, profits are frequently reinvested to expand capacity or develop new technologies, whereas, quote, state-owned hydropower companies may use profits to fund dam projects. Surprisingly, a portion of the profits from state-owned industries are distributed as dividends and, yes, even share buybacks, reflecting a focus on shareholder returns rather than solely reinvesting in production. But these distributions pale in comparison to those in the US that pay out nearly 100% of annual earnings. In short, there is much more money available to support, quote, broader state objectives such as infrastructure and social welfare programs. And the amount of money we are talking about is simply staggering. Consider this. China's state-owned enterprise account for 30 to 40% of China's GDP and control about 68% of total firm capital, which attests to the truly unprecedented economic power of the government. In 2021, central SOEs reported net profits of 283.56 billion, 100 billion of which went to the Belt and Road Initiative. In 2023, China's SOEs generated 650 billion in profits, the vast majority of which was devoted to production, innovation, efficiency, critical infrastructure, and social programs. It is any wonder why the Chinese people are so, quote, satisfied with their government. This isn't a matter of capitalism versus communism. It's a matter of good government versus lousy government. Virtually all the profit extracted from our, quote, free market system go into the pockets of the people who need the money the least and who fail to contribute anything of value to the greater good. In contrast, the Chinese government is pumping nearly every penny into improvements that benefit everyone and that have transformed the country into a shining example of the 21st century modernity. Shockingly, our leaders in Washington still think of the United States can, quote, outcompete and even surpass China if we just put our minds to it and make it a national priority. But anyone who can, quote, do the math can see that's not going to happen. It's simply a matter of time of which country has the superior development model. And in that regard, China has us beat hands down.
Okay, and it does.
It does.
But we have to keep in mind that first sentence of this section. This isn't a matter of capitalism as opposed to communism. It's a matter of good government, versus lousy government.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, what the Chinese are obviously doing is they're focusing on the public purpose of improving life for all the people of China. That is not a goal uh, that is somehow communist in character. I mean, it's not a goal that is dictated by but communism alone. The idea of accomplishing the public purpose, okay, and doing what's best for the people of the United States, uh, that's just a common sense goal of good government. But it's not a goal that our country is pursuing right now. Certain times in the history of the United States, our government did pursue that. At the time of the New Deal, it certainly did pursue of the public purpose. For a time after World War II, people thought of the government as pursuing what was good for all the people, and it did seem to be doing that. When did this end? I think it ended with the victory of Ronald Reagan, in 1980. That changed the overall orientation of the government as trying to do what's good for the public in general, trying to accomplish the public purpose, as opposed to just trying to create conditions where individuals could get very, very, very rich. That's what changed during the Reagan administration and going forward. I think if we went back to the days where we were looking for good government and to accomplish the public purpose here in the United States, we'd be able to develop the vision, and the goals to guide industrial policy and to develop the various sectors of our society in a way that was good for all, of the people. And to do it that way, to use economics for the public purpose, isn't communism or socialism. It's simply very American. It's what motivated us a long time ago. And that purpose, that way of looking at government, was invented here in America. It was not invented in Europe. It was not a function of Marxism, Leninism, or anything like that. The fact that the Chinese have found their way to that through communism at some point is a matter of historical accomplishment for them. But doesn't make their goal of good government somehow communistic. We always thought here in the United States that good government was about doing things for all the people, for all Americans, for accomplishing the public purpose. We have to return to that idea. We have to get rid of the corruption in government. We have to make sure government is dedicated to doing that. And we have to realize that systematic industrial policy and central planning, which is implemented on a local basis in line with local needs, that is not communism. That is Americanism. That is a larger sort, of pragmatism. And we need to feel free to do that and not worry about the ideological categories. They don't mean anything. But good government for the public purpose, that means something. And that's what we ought to pursue here. And if planning helps that, we need to do planning. If industrial policy helps that, we need to do industrial policy. If implementing it at local levels through federal job guarantees and other such measures, if that is central to good government, then we have to implement that and not worry about the ideological categories. Debating capitalism versus communism, or socialism, versus communism, that's about dividing us. But working for good government and for public purpose, and working that way pragmatically, is about bringing us together to accomplish something that we all recognize as good for all of us. So we need to get rid of these broad categories that deal with ideologies that arose out of the 18th century and that arose out of the 19th century and that governed us for much of the 20th century and that are no longer appropriate for the 21st century. And we have to go back to the old idea of good government, pragmatically realized with any method that can help us to realize it. And we have to work to make that happen in our country. We have to use economics for the public purpose. And the type of economics that is devoted to the public purpose in these days is the modern money theory school of economics. So that's what we have to pursue here. And then China won't be beating us hands down. But also we have to recognize living in the same world as China and Russia, and other nations is not about competing with somebody for the sake of competing with them. What it's about is doing the best we can to achieve good government and great conditions for living for all of our people. That is what our government is responsible for here in the United States. And we must make our government meet that kind of standard and forget about whether we're beating the Chinese or whether we're beating the Russians or whether we're beating anybody else. It's about us being the best that we can be and doing the best that we can for ourselves, and our people, and living in a collaborative and constructive way with the rest of the world. Any comments, Dee?
I think you pretty much said it all.
Well, thank you. I don't think I meant to say it all, but
You did.
okay, but
And it's how many times have we had that conversation, you know?
yes. And I'm sure we'll have it hundreds more times before we're through.
Exactly.
And so we have a few more comments to take before we say goodbye. Brad Jobbett is here.
Hello.
Who is Brad Jobbett? He is a good friend of Shane Coughlin's, who is a good friend of ours. John B. says, rentier capitalism at full throttle. The mobility of capital across nations ensures that all nations are the prey of capital. It's like a casino where the elites pit nation versus nation to extract profit. Yes, John B., that often happens, but it is not absolutely necessary for that to happen. We have to fight against that. Almost all international, likely domestic capital movements to extract parasitic arbitrage, less than minus 4% of Forex volumes, is due physical trade, real service provision. Parasites are us. Thank you, John B., for that image. That is true, but I think the role of governments should be to stop that kind of extraction. And to do that, it'll be necessary for all political systems to dump the corruption in their systems. And Steve GII says China has a system that's rivaling Starlink 2. Earl of Lurl waves to Steve G2. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Steve GII, Steve G2. Brad Jobbitt, can you post a link to the article? Yeah, there's a link to the article in the description. If you look at the description of uh, the YouTube, you will find a link to the article. I'm not sure which article you're referring to, but you will find a link to all the articles. So you will find a link to this one. Earl of Lurtle points out it's from the UN's review. I don't know which article you're talking about, but if you're talking about the Mike Whitney article, that was from the UN's review. If you're talking about the Wabin article, which was even more important than the Mike Whitney article, that was also from the UN's review. Yeah, it's at unz.com. Earl of Lurl says, I got to go to bed. Thanks for the show. Thank you, Earl, for coming. Earl says, have a good night. Steve G2 says, there's a loose zog in the machine. I don't know what a zog is. And Jambi says, the rot started with Johnson, who gave the CIA its head in Indonesia, killing 1 million people. Then there was Vietnam, another imperial venture for great corporate profit. In Australia, CIA plus MI56 destabilized. PM Whitlam, two socialists, gave Australia Medibank for all, which was promptly reversed by U.S.-friendly conservatives. The rot goes back a long way. Corruption is the common key. I'm sure that is true, John B. I'm sure that is true. Okay, by the way, it was Lyndon Johnson who was the first person who allowed the Democratic Party to go out and raise money from the large corporations. For a while there, the Democrats did not take money from large corporate interests. They left that market to the Republicans. And the Democrats perpetually were outraised by the Republicans in election after election, after election. Lyndon Johnson changed all that, during the 1960s. And that was what eventually led to the corruption of the Democratic Party. As long as the Democratic Party relied on small donors and the labor unions, it was biased towards legislating in the interest of the people from the New Deal period on. But that changed during the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson. I think John Kennedy might have had the same thing in mind, but it was Lyndon Johnson who implemented it from the standpoint of the party. So I think that's interesting. Mr. Wonderful said, JECCC, the Joint Center for Control and Coordination on Ceasefire. Thank you. And Mr. Wonderful, the Joint Center for Control and Coordination, I don't know which. Steve G says Steve Gonzo and Ghost Start works too. Oh, thanks for coming, Steve. I missed you. And ZOG says Zionist occupied government. Thank you. Great. That's great. Okay. So I think it's time to say goodnight.
Okay, good night, everyone.
Okay,
It's good
thank
seeing
you.
everybody.
Okay, thank you, D. I will see you again then.
Yes, you'll be on Saturday, right? Saturday at 9 p.m. you'll be on again?
I will be on again at 9 p.m. Okay, on Saturday. I'm still not ready to participate in the middle of a week. There are a lot of things I have to do besides this, unfortunately, right now.
Okay.
So I won't be coming on during the middle of the week, but I will be on Saturday.
That
John B. says,
sounds good.
bye all. And Steve Gonzo says, he waves. A good wave.
Yeah, I should be on tomorrow at 9:30 p.m. And then on Thursday, Harsh Med joins me on Thursday at around 9:30
Okay, and you'll be on with
Eastern
Matt
time.
tomorrow, right?
Most likely we'll see if, how Madeline's doing.
Okay.
Yeah, Madeline and I won last night.
Yeah, I guess I saw that the two of you
Mhm.
last night.
Yes, so what should I say? Good night to Bonnie. Good night, Bonnie.
Yeah, Barney is here now
Okay, that's good.
and looking very sprightly as well.
Oh, good. That's good news.
Okay, thank you, Dee.
Okay, good night. Yes, good night, everyone.
Have a great night.
You too.